What is going on, Diablo 2 fans? Dobrunsky here. In today's video, I'm going to be presenting a updated tier list from the original tier list that I made for the second version of PTR. There's actually been some pretty significant changes, so believe it or not, I have adjusted the rankings for 6 existing builds, and I've actually introduced 7 new builds with this latest patch update. Now, I want to be very clear, technically, they're not really new builds, they've just been significantly changed. So, for example, the Fisthaven and Paladin, I would classify that as a new build because while it is true you could rock it in LOD, it was primarily just like a Grizzcaddy light facet PvP sort of thing, but it is in my eyes a new build that is a lot more viable in PvM. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Again, sound off in the comment section below if you guys agree, disagree, or would tweak anything for my rankings for my tier list. I kind of weigh everything overall, so a combination of how effective is it at clearing Slate Players 1, 3, and 8. Is it a really good magic finding character? Does it have good survivability? Does it require super expensive gear? And I just kind of like rate it all in one jumbled like mess. Like, I'm not going to be going through the factors, but again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree with my rankings. And again, if you guys do enjoy this YouTube content, I have the link for my Twitch channel in the description below. Any follows on that platform would be very much appreciated. That being said, guys, let's jump in. Okay, so one other thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm not going to reference existing builds like the Javazon, Hammerden, Blizzard Sorceress, Lightning Sorceress, Smiter. We all kind of know where those rank in an overall tier list. Again, it was requested in the previous video. If you guys do really want to see it, I guess I can make a massive tier list comparing everything, but that is a pretty overwhelming build. But this video, I'm just going to focus on, again, what I would consider either a change in tier or a new build that has been created because of the meta shifting in PTR version 2. So I will have the original video linked in the description below. But first thing, we're going to start off with C tier, discussing the Bear Sorceress. Now, I do think that overall, they made some positive changes with the IS calculation, especially on the Fury Druid. The Werebear, it's an interesting build. Like, you get tons of damage. It's hard for me to say, like, uninterruptible attack, maul, something like Earth Shifter, or some crazy Breath of the Dying base, and Thunder Maul, that kind of thing. You have tons of damage, tons of crowd control, stun effect, and uninterruptible maul. It's all really good stuff, but unfortunately, due to the change in the IS calculator, you can now hit faster with slower weapons, but really previous fast-hitting weapons like Shelled Grizzcaddy or Shelled Phaseblades with a lightning facet, those now attack slower. So this ultimately, in my opinion, shifts the Bear Sorceress down from what would be like an A-tier build that requires very expensive gear and tons of like buff swapping and that kind of thing. It was an annoying build, but it was something that crushed Ubers and was fun to play. That is now, in my eyes, shifted down to a C-tier build because this whole build relied on having a crazy lightning damage and fire damage from enchant, and then hitting as fast as you possibly could when your sorceress shifting into bear form. The fact that you now hit very slow with these fast-hitting weapons, ultimately, in my eyes, is a significant nerf to the Bear Sorceress. Again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree. It's been a long time since I've played the Bear Sorceress build, and most of it was, or not most of it, all of it was in original LOD, but I just can't see how a slower hitting weapon, and you don't have Maul as a Bear Sorceress. So I just think it's a net nerf, even though it's still tons of damage, you're attacking slower, so it's a net DPS drop, which shifts it down to, in my opinion, a C tier build. So moving on to the B tier, let's cover some of the new builds. So the first one I want to talk about is the Beastmaster Druid. So this I kind of dubbed a hybrid version of the Summoning Druid. Now, I actually think it performs better than a Summoning Druid. I'm just a little bit hesitant to sort of rank it as an A-tier build. Maybe if it's a B+, the full-on Summoning Druid is maybe B-. Reason why I think it's kind of a better build is the fact that if you just sacrifice some plus summoning skills for one hard-hitting weapon, maybe a hard-hitting body armor, and then a couple of points to either shift into Werewolf to then use Fury, or Werebear to then use Maul, you get very good physical DPS, but then after that, if you focus on having a whole bunch of extra summoning skills, you can then summon an entire army that runs with you, so you're like running with the wolves kind of aspect, and that's why I kind of called it the Beastmaster build. But it's very powerful because you have tons of DPS from your Ravens, your Spirit Wolves, your Dire Wolves, and your Bear, but then you also have a ton of life from shapeshifting, as well as substantial physical damage as well. Comparing that to the counterpart, just the Summoning Druid, where you're all summons, a little bit more DPS, but then you're losing that extra life and, you know, defense and fury damage, that kind of thing. So the Beastmaster Druid, the fact that you can summon all of your summons now and then invest in one hard-hitting weapon, hard-hitting body armor, like Fortitude, and then a couple shape-shifting points, makes this a very good build. I kind of would almost call it B+, but then not quite A tier. And then another shift, or sort of new build, I should say, is the Fire Boazon. So they essentially reduce the cooldown on Immolation Arrow. So it actually makes it a more effective skill. But due to the way the bow skills work, you can actually have a pretty good Fire Boa, but then still invest in some other powerful Boazon skills like Freezing Arrow. So you can have crowd control effect, you can just ping back and forth between Freezing Arrow and Immolation Arrow. And one of the biggest issues with the Fire Boazon, preventing it from going to like A tier, because with really good gear, 220 Jabs on gloves, like Boa skillers, even like new Flickering Flame Helmet, Hand of Justice and a Bow, all very expensive stuff, but you can mow down stuff that isn't fire immune. But the main issue is just fire immunities. That kind of goes for every single fire build in Diablo 2. But the fact that you can supplement with Freezing Arrow and they reduce the cooldown time, I would kind of consider the Fire Bow, a new build, and I would rank it kind of B, B-, something like that. And that's just due to the pure like sheer fire immunities. It could go even higher, but I think B- is a good spot. And then finally, the last new build is the Maul Werebear. So it's an improved build, but I just don't think the slower nature of it and the uninterruptible attack, it just makes it a worse version of Fury. And I get the whole idea of sort of like sticking to the lore or the fantasy of the Werebear. The whole idea is it's like an unstoppable force, and it has good survivability, tons of crowd control, tons of damage, but it's just slow. If you compare it to the Reaper Wolf, do even like players 1, 3, or players 8 cast Sanctuary run to players 1, 3, or players 8 with the Maul Werebear, it's substantially slower. You won't die, but ultimately builds are largely ranked against how fast they can clear areas, and the fact that the Maul Werebear is slower than Fear Druid makes me want to introduce the new changes as B tier, although I will kind of like the silver lining here is point out that some weapons that previously did not work as good for the Werebear, like Breath of the Dying Thunder Maul, Earthshaker, that kind of thing, slower hard-hitting weapons, you now attack faster, so they are improved in that sense, but overall, I can't really give them anything higher than B tier. And then talking about some existing changes in tiers, I guess, the Summoning Druid is definitely bumped up from the previous C tier that I ranked it to a B tier, and that's just because you can now summon everything at the same time. Although, I'll be entirely honest, with like Reaper's Toll Mercenary, Might Aura, using Beast, all summoning skillers, Ravenlore, the maximum amount of plus skills, it's still not that good. Like, it's not that it's bad, like it looks cool having a full army and you can do everything in the game. You can even do Ubers because you can just keep recasting your summons. It's not like a Summon Necro where you need to find corpses, so it's all good that way, but it's not amazing. And then finally, normal Holy Fire Paladin, due to the fact that they reworked some of the changes with the auras, so you no longer have that scaling aura pulse effect, but when they're in melee range, you're doing double the amount of fire damage. So more fire damage, ultimately, I think bumps it up from C to B tier, although it's not quite kind of the Tesladin, so that's why I wouldn't rank it anything higher than B tier. So moving on to the A tier builds, one point that I want to mention is that you'll notice from the previous video there is significantly more S and A tier builds than the previous version of PTR. Very excited for that because one of the main criticisms that I had was that the devs knew what to address, but they didn't twist the throttle enough, and we finally got some gas on some of these different builds. So gonna cover Strafe, Amazon, that should be multi-shot, not multi-show, but I'm not fixing it now, Throw Barbarian, and Fireclaw. So let's start off with the changes in tiers. Essentially for the Strafe Amazon, they added additional damage synergies. So I tested pretty much perfect Windforce Faith Merc and Faith Boazon with a Pride Might Merc, and I had 11k damage with Faith and 12k damage with Windforce. So that is pretty crazy. 11, 12k-ish physical damage with endgame setups, with Strafe being able to hit multiple times. It is a huge improvement. I was mowing down through players 1 and 3 Chaos, and I was actually even doing players 8 Chaos pretty effectively, so I do think that it's appropriate to shift the Strafe Boazon up from B to A. And then the Throw Barbarian, major change here is that Throw Mastery now has a chance to replenish quantity and not use quantity when you're throwing. So the main problem I had with the Throw Barb, with using like Eth Lacerator and Eth Warstrike, was that you would literally run out of ammo. So you had to like boss snipe, Chaos Sanctuary, and then wait a little bit to replenish the quantity because it was like precious. It was literally like gold, your throwing weapon quantity. You can now pretty much run this build and not have to worry about that. So it's a huge quality of life adjustment. And damage wasn't the issue because Again, I was testing with a very good setup, but I was boss sniping players at Chaos and having no issues. So the fact that you can now not worry about weapon quantity definitely, in my eyes, bumps up the throw bar from B to A. And then covering these new builds, the multi-show, which is supposed to be shot, it's not necessarily a new build. Like, you could rock it before, but I think that the massive changes in the damage synergies, the fact that it receives damage from guided arrow and that multi-shot synergizes guided arrow, just makes for a very powerful combination of using multi-shot for boss targets, or excuse me, multi-shot for boss groups, and then guided arrow for single target. It's a massive damage buff, large improvement. Unfortunately, I didn't really get a chance to test this because prior to making this video, the damage synergies weren't properly applying yet, but just kind of basing on the judgment of how the damage buff up for Strafe bumped it from B to A, you would have to assume that applying an additional damage buff to multi-shot would make it better as well. I stand on the hill, or I die on the hill, that I think Strafe is better than multi-shot, especially now that you don't start at 3/4 weapon damage. You have extra synergies, and you can use Atma's Scarab Amulet for amp damage procs, but multi-shot is definitely improved. And I think with endgame gear, it's an A tier build, so it kind of matches the adjustment of the cost. Now, I know PvPers are very upset with the Strafe and multi-shot changes, but I just genuinely don't know how you properly adjust that, because prior to these changes was a massive high rune investment build that sub-performed in my opinion, so I understand that these changes are significantly shifting the meta for PvP, but I don't know, we had a long time of garbage bosons for PVM, so I don't really know what the best answer is. I just know that it is significant improvement for PVM. And then the final build I want to cover here is the Fireclaw Wolf. Now, I know that you could do /bear, and then right above it I do have the Fireclaw Druid, but the reason why I kind of wanted to call it a new build is because I think the Wolf is so much better than the Bear due to the changes in the IS calculator for Fury, how you can use harder hitting weapons and still attack faster. So you can throw on like an Zotted Earthshifter and then pump a bunch of points into Armageddon and then synergize Fireclaw, and you can bounce back and forth between using like a 5k Geddon, having 10k Fireclaw, and then having like a 10 to 15k Fury. When you combine everything together, it just makes for a super powerful build, and that's why I would kind of rank it higher, because in previous to this PTR, it was pretty much exclusively Fireclaw builds would be mostly associated with the Werebear, because you could use crazy IS weapons and reach very fast breakpoints. But now that you can use harder hitting weapons, get faster breakpoints, and then have crazy fire damage and get it in Wolf, I just wanted to call it a new build, so I'm ultimately ranking that an A tier setup. But overall, I think that all of these builds are vastly improved to what they were in PTR, and I would definitely recommend anything that's A tier and up was a great, fantastic build to rock for the first ladder of Diablo 2. So rounding out the end of the video, we're going to cover all of the new and changes for the S tier builds. Now, the first one is definitely, we got to talk about the Fist of Heaven's Paladin. I thought it was a very niche, kind of like bordering B or maybe A tier build, just because it did fantastic damage to the undead, but it was very slow against demons. The Holy Bolts now pierce and damage demons, so this build has better AoE, it's not as teleport dependent, and works better with more budget gear than a Hammer did. It absolutely crushes Chaos Sanctuary. You can use multiple different auras. You sort of open up what's the best merc choice, because you're not really relying on Conviction, because you can either rock Conviction yourself, or you can rely entirely on the Holy Bolt damage, so you're open to using different mercenary combinations. It's a very cool build to use. Super powerful, and ultimately has to be classified as an S tier build. Just that simple change of damage to demons versus only damaging the undead, like that additional damage, just makes it an amazing build. And covering the latest new builds, now that I think about it, I probably should have rated the Tesladin maybe a change in tier, but I didn't rank it on the previous PTR because it was already an existing build. There wasn't really anything to talk about, but they did rework sort of the walkback on the offensive aura changes, that now monsters that are within range of your Holy Shock aura, when they're right in melee range, you're doing 200% damage instead of 100%. So Tesladin was already a powerful character, and I think the fact that you are doubling the lightning damage in melee range has to bump it up from an A tier to an S tier. Now, out of all the builds on here, I would maybe rank the Tesladin the lowest on the S tier list, but I definitely think it's jumped up from being like an A plus to an S minus, my opinion, and that's just because of that extra 200% damage when you're in melee range. And the last two builds here, the Reaper Wolf. This is essentially a Fury Druid, but again, due to the changes in the IS calculator, you can now use slower, harder hitting weapons and attack faster. So if you use a Zodded Ethereal Reaper's Toll, in my opinion, there is absolutely nothing better for a Fury Druid setup. I didn't have a perfect inventory, but I had 18,000 max damage with, I think, a level 17 concentration Pride. So if I was to get level 20 concentration and use an ideal inventory setup, I don't see why I couldn't get 21k max damage, constantly proc Decrepify. Because you're procking Decrep, you're not reliant on a Reaper's Toll Mercenary, so you can use Pride for more damage. You have tons of Deadly Strike. With G-Face, Gores, High Lords, and Reaper's Toll, I had 98% Deadly Strike, 50% Crushing Blow, tons of max damage. Between Feral Rage and the Life Leech that I had, I was running max strength build, wiping through players 8, and not even having any close calls. So technically the Reaper Wolf is a Fury Druid, just using Eth Reapers, but it is an S tier melee build in my opinion. And the last build to talk about is the Charge Strike Spears on. So this whole build, it's again not really a new build because you could use Charge Strike and Lightning Strike with Spears prior to this patch, but they now give you the ability to wield Infinity in Spears and Amazon Spears. So Matriarchal Pike or Matriarchal Spear, rolled Infinity, you get to take advantage of the extra negative lightning res. I was running around, couldn't tell the difference between players 1, 3, or 8. That's how good the build was in Chaos Sanctuary. You go flying into a monster pack, Lightning Strike once, and then those lightning bolts just pierce and ping like, I think it was like 45 different times. And so it's just going through doing damage to monsters. While it's killing stuff, you're clearing up like the sloppy seconds with Charge Strike. It was a very, very powerful build and definitely S tier in my opinion. But that basically wraps up everything, guys. Again, like I said in the intro, I wasn't going to cover existing builds. I just wanted to talk about some of the massive shifts. But again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree with my assessment. I do largely think it's pretty accurate. Again, I'm biased. It is my own video, but feedback is always welcome as long as you're not a dick. Other than that, if you did enjoy the video, if you could throw a like on it, that'd be awesome. And I'll catch you guys on my next video or live stream. Peace out.